As the last brick kissed the mouth of the dry well, the mute wanderer traced the name of Al-Hakam into the stifling Damascus air, and that night the walls of Harun's palace began to creep inward, inch by merciless inch, upon his lungs. The sun over Damascus in the 17th century was not merely a celestial body but a physical weight, a relentless hammer of molten gold that beat the ancient city into a delirious submission. It was a heat that boiled the sewage in the open gutters until the air tasted of rot and dying jasmine, a sickly perfume for a metropolis that was slowly drowning in its own opulent sins. Amidst this sweltering purgatory, where the stones of the street radiated a feverish warmth even long after midnight, the court of the magistrate stood as a cool, marble cavern of terror. Here sat Qadi Harun, a man who had long since severed the humble tether that binds a human soul to the earth. To the wretches dragged before him in chains, Harun was not a servant of the law but a creature of nightmare, draped in robes of crimson silk that rustled like the dry wings of carrion birds circling a carcass. He presided over the high bench with a stillness that was unnatural, his eyes devoid of the flickering light of empathy, resembling the flat, dead gaze of a shark that has never known the necessity of sleep nor the grace of mercy. In his right hand, he clutched a gavel carved from the heart of an ironwood tree, a dense and heavy instrument that did not merely punctuate his sentences but seemed to crush the very hope from the air when it struck the sounding block. The people of Damascus, from the water sellers with their cracked lips to the wealthy merchants trembling in their velvet doublets, whispered that Harun had forgotten he was made of clay and blood. He had ceased to consult the sacred scrolls of jurisprudence or the wisdom of the elders. Instead, a dark and cancerous arrogance had bloomed within his chest, a heresy of the spirit that convinced him he possessed the divine attribute of Al-Hakam, the ultimate judge. He believed his voice was no longer his own but the conduit of absolute truth, and thus his whims became the law, and his prejudices became the scripture. He would watch the accused not with the scrutiny of an investigator, but with the boredom of a god to whom the lives of men are but insects scuttling in the dust. There was no defense in his court, for how does one argue with a man who believes he sees the unseen? He sentenced thieves to lose hands for stealing bread while letting murderers walk free if they amused him or flattered his gargantuan vanity. The courtroom was silent, save for the buzzing of fat flies that feasted on the sweat of the condemned, and the terrifying crack of the ironwood gavel which signaled the end of a life as casually as one might swat a mosquito. It was whispered in the darkened corners of the tea-houses that Harun had begun to look at the sky with a challenge in his eyes, daring the heavens to correct him, intoxicated by the terrifying silence that follows a verdict from which there is no appeal. He sat upon his cushioned throne, surrounded by the stench of fear and the incense of his own ego, unaware that by assuming the mantle of the arbitrator, he had invited a scrutiny far more terrible than any he could dispense. The city groaned under his tyranny, and the very stones of the courthouse seemed to weep with the injustice of it, yet Qadi Harun only smiled a thin, bloodless smile, believing himself to be the apex of power in a world that was rapidly shrinking to fit the size of his own madness. It was upon a Tuesday afternoon, when the shadows were short and sharp as daggers, that the great doors of the courthouse groaned open to admit a disturbance that would seal the fate of the magistrate forever. The heat in the chamber had curdled into a suffocating thickness, a palpable miasma of unwashed bodies and fear that clung to the tapestries and slicked the marble floors with a sheen of moisture. Into this stagnant pool of misery, the city guards dragged a figure who seemed composed of the very dust of the desert, a wandering mystic whose robes were tattered ribbons of burlap and whose feet were calloused from walking the burning sands of the Levant. He was not a man of substance, nor did he possess the coin to bribe a scribe for a favorable hearing, yet he walked with a terrifying fluidity, moving not as a prisoner but as a guest who had arrived precisely at his appointed hour. The charges laid against him were as nebulous as smoke, whispered by a gaggle of fat, perspiring merchants who huddled near the bench like nervous sheep. They claimed he had spoken words in the marketplace that soured the milk of their authority, parables that suggested the gold in their purses was heavier than the souls in their chests, and that true judgment belonged not to those in silk but to the unseen. To Qadi Harun, who sat high upon his dais wiping his brow with a perfumed handkerchief, these accusations were not merely annoyances, they were direct assaults upon the divinity he believed he embodied. He leaned forward, the wood of his throne creaking under his shifting weight, and peered down at the dervish with eyes that demanded the currency of terror. He expected the wailing pleas for mercy that usually filled the hall, the tearing of clothes, the desperate bargaining for a hand or a tongue. But the mystic offered him nothing but a silence so profound it seemed to suck the noise from the room. The magistrate's voice boomed through the hall, demanding to know the name of the wretch in his village, but the man remained still, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze fixed not on Harun's face, but on the space just above his turban, as if looking at a spider descending from the rafters. The silence stretched until it became a physical tension, vibrating against the eardrums of the onlookers. Harun's face darkened, the veins in his neck bulging like cords of rope as the insult of this silence took root in his heart. He felt exposed, for in the mystic's clear, unblinking eyes, there was no reflection of Harun the Great, Harun the Judge, or Harun the Al-Hakam, there was only a reflection of a small, sweating man in a ridiculous hat playing a game he did not understand. The merchants shifted uncomfortably, sensing the volatility of the moment, for a tyrant ignored is a tyrant unmade. Driven by a sudden, jagged spike of fury that bypassed all reason, Harun slammed his ironwood gavel down with a force that chipped the block. He did not call for witnesses. He did not consult the books of law that gathered dust on the lower shelves. He declared that since the man loved silence so dearly, he would be granted an eternity of it. The sentence was not the lash, nor the scimitar, for those were punishments for men of flesh, this was a punishment for a ghost. Harun decreed that the mystic be taken to the drying well in the central courtyard, a hollow shaft of ancient stone that had long since ceased to give water, and that he be sealed within it, brick by heavy brick, until he was one with the darkness he so cherished. A collective gasp, cold and sharp, sucked through the teeth of the gallery, for this was a death of slow, maddening horror, a cruelty that belonged to the dark ages before the light of civilization. Yet, no man spoke a word of protest, for the Qadi's eyes were wide and white, rolling in a frenzy of absolute power. The guards, hesitant at first, seized the mystic by his rough arms, but he did not struggle. As they dragged him backward, his bare feet leaving trails in the dust, he lifted one gnarled, sun-browned finger and pointed it first at the ceiling, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, leveled it at the heart of the magistrate. He traced a shape in the air, a singular, looping script that every soul in the room recognized as the invocation of the one who truly judges. It was a condemnation without a sound, a verdict delivered by the victim upon the executioner. Harun shrieked for them to take him away, his voice cracking into a falsetto of panic and rage, desperate to break the eye contact that felt like a hook in his soul. They hauled the man into the blinding glare of the courtyard, where the sun beat down on the white stones with merciless intensity. Masons were summoned from their work on the city walls, arriving with trowels and hods of wet, grey mortar that smelled of the river bottom. The mystic was lowered into the cylindrical gloom of the well, the space tight and smelling of damp earth and centuries of neglect. He stood at the bottom, the circle of blue sky above him framing the faces of his tormentors like a distant coin. The first brick was laid with a wet slap that echoed up the shaft, a sound of finality that rang clearer than any bell. Then came another, and another, the rhythmic scraping of metal on stone becoming a metronome counting down the remaining moments of light. Harun stood on the balcony above, gripping the stone railing until his knuckles turned the color of old parchment, watching the wall rise. He needed the man to scream. He needed to hear the begging that would validate his power, that would prove he was the master of this creature's fate. But the well remained silent. The wall rose past the mystic's waist, past his chest, past the hollow of his throat. The masons worked with averted eyes, fearful of the bad luck that clings to such deeds, their trowels flashing in the sun. As the aperture narrowed to a single, jagged hole, a sliver of darkness against the blinding sun, Harun leaned over, straining his ears, desperate for a cry, a curse, anything to break the divine quiet. But there was only the sound of the wind sighing over the lip of the stonework and the scratch of the final brick being specifically fitted into place. The last trowel of mortar sealed the gap, shutting out the sun, the air, and the world of men. The courtyard fell into a heavy stillness, broken only by the panting of the magistrate who stared at the fresh, wet wall, terrifyingly aware that while he had successfully trapped the man's body, the silence he had sought to bury had somehow escaped, and was now rising like invisible smoke to fill the entirety of his own house. 3 nights had passed since the laying of the final brick, 3 nights in which the city of Damascus had continued its breathless turning under the wheel of the stars, indifferent to the tragedy sealed within the courtyard of the magistrate. The heat had not broken, but had instead settled into a heavy, stagnant permanence, a thick woolen blanket of temperature that made the very act of drawing breath a labor for the lungs. In the great house of Qadi Harun, the silence was no longer merely the absence of noise. It had curdled into a physical presence, a dense and suffocating medium that filled the hallways and pooled in the corners like invisible water. The servants moved through the corridors with the terrified hushed steps of those walking through a tomb, their eyes darting toward the central courtyard where the new stonework of the well stood stark and pale in the moonlight, a monument to a justice that had been twisted into murder. Harun himself had retreated to the sanctity of his private chambers, a sprawling suite of rooms draped in the finest silks from the east and carpeted with woven masterpieces that had taken generations of fingers to knot. He sought to distance himself from the deed, to drown the memory of the mystic's pointing finger in goblets of sweet sherbet and the smoke of expensive hashish, but the architecture of his own home seemed to have turned against him. On this 3rd night, a Tuesday that bled slowly into a Wednesday, the magistrate lay upon his vast bed, a mattress stuffed with the down of 1,000 geese, designed to cradle a king in weightless slumber. Yet, as the oil lamps burned low, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like dervishes against the tiled walls, Harun found that sleep was a country whose borders were closed to him. He lay on his back, staring up at the intricate geometric patterns of the ceiling, the stars and hexagons painted in lapis and gold, and he waited for the release of dreams that refused to come. Instead of drifting away, he felt a strange and subtle pressure settling upon his chest. At first, it was dismissible, a mere indigestion from a rich supper of roasted lamb and spiced rice, a tightness born of the humors of the body. He shifted his position, rolling to his side, punching the silk pillows into new shapes, seeking a comfort that slid away from him like water through a clenched fist. But the sensation did not dissipate, it grew. It was a gradual accumulation of gravity, as if the air directly above his bed had thickened, condensing into a solid mass that pressed down with a deliberate, intelligent intent. Harun sat up, gasping, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his nightshirt clinging to his skin with cold, clammy sweat. He rubbed his chest, expecting to find a bruise or a constricting band, but his flesh was unmarked, pale and flabby in the dim light. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his feet finding the cool reassurance of the marble floor, and walked to the window. He threw open the wooden shutters, desperate for a draught of fresh air, but the night outside was still and dead, the heat rising from the stones of the courtyard below where the well stood in the shadows. He stared at it, that cylinder of silence, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he fancied he could see a shimmering distortion in the air above it, a heat haze that rose from the sealed earth and drifted like a slow, poisonous vapor toward his window. He slammed the shutters closed, bolting them with trembling hands, and turned back to the room. The air within the chamber felt thinner now, used up, as if someone, or something, else had been breathing it in while he watched the well. He returned to his bed, telling himself he was a man of logic, a scholar of the law, not a peasant frightened by ghouls and spirits. He lay down once more, determining to force his mind into submission as he forced the people of his court. But the moment his head touched the pillow, the weight returned, and this time, it did not creep, it fell. It was an instant, crushing burden, as though a heavy sack of wet sand had been dropped directly onto his sternum. The breath was driven from his lungs in a sharp, wheezing grunt. His eyes bulged in the semi-darkness, scanning the room wildly for an attacker, for the assassin who must surely be kneeling upon his chest, strangling the life from him. But there was no one. The room was empty. The shadows in the corners remained still. The heavy velvet drapes hung motionless. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, sliced through his arrogance. He tried to shout, to roar for his guards, but the pressure on his chest was so great that his voice was squeezed into a thin, pathetic squeak. He thrashed, his limbs flailing against the silk sheets, kicking and clawing at the empty air, fighting a phantom that had no body to strike. He rolled, heaving his torso with a strength born of pure terror, and managed to throw himself from the bed onto the floor. The impact jarred his bones, but the weight vanished the instant he left the mattress. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, crab walking into the center of the room, his breath coming in jagged, tearing gasps. He screamed then, a full-throated cry of rage and fear that shattered the stillness of the mansion. Guards! Assassins! To me! To me! The doors burst open within seconds, the heavy wood splintering against the wall as 4 of his elite Mamluks rushed in, scimitars drawn, their faces masks of disciplined violence. They scanned the room, weapons ready to cut down any intruder, their eyes darting from the open wardrobe to the space behind the divan. They saw their master, the great Qadi Harun, cowering on the carpet in his nightclothes, pointing a trembling finger at the empty bed. "Find him!" Harun shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "He is there. He was upon me. Crush him as he sought to crush me." The captain of the guard, a giant of a man with scars etched into his dark skin, moved cautiously toward the bed. He prodded the pillows with the tip of his blade. He looked under the frame. He threw open the wardrobe doors. He signaled his men to sweep the room. They tore the heavy drapes from the windows, they overturned the cedar chests, they checked the balcony. There was no one. The room was hermetically sealed, the only entrance guarded by the very men who now stood baffled amidst the disarray. The captain turned to Harun, sheathing his sword with a confused frown. "My lord," he said, his voice rough with sleep and perplexity, "there is no one here. The room is empty. The bolts on the windows are drawn from the inside." Harun stared at him, his mind reeling. He knew what he had felt. It was not a dream. The bruising pressure had been real, physical, undeniable. He staggered to his feet, clutching his robe around him, his dignity in tatters. "Search the halls," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual iron. "Search the roof. Someone has been here." The guards bowed and retreated to carry out the feudal order, leaving Harun alone once more. He stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, waiting for the adrenaline to fade. Slowly, tentatively, he approached the bed again. It looked innocuous, a raft of comfort in the sea of the room. He reached out a hand and pressed down on the mattress. It was soft, yielding. He sat on the edge. Nothing happened. He lay back, cautiously, keeping one foot on the floor, ready to spring. For a minute, there was peace. Then, 2 minutes. He began to relax, his eyelids drooping, telling himself it was a nightmare brought on by the heat. But then, it began again. Not from above this time, but from within. It started as a heaviness in his very bones, a sensation that the marrow within him was turning to lead. And with the weight came a smell, faint at first, then overpowering. It was not the scent of jasmine or rosewater that permeated his sheets. It was the smell of wet, gray mortar. It was the smell of damp earth in a confined space. It was the smell of stale air that has been breathed over and over again. Harun gagged, sitting up, but the smell followed him. It was not in the room, it was in his nose, in his throat. He realized with a jolt of horror that made his blood run cold that the sensation was not merely a weight pressing down, it was the sensation of being enclosed. The vast, high-ceilinged bedroom was shrinking in his perception. The walls seemed to be leaning inward, just a fraction of an inch. The ceiling seemed lower. The air was becoming thin, devoid of oxygen. He was not merely being haunted, he was sharing the sensory experience of the man he had walled into the darkness 3 nights ago. The connection had been made, the circuit completed by the mystic's curse. Harun stood in the center of his palatial room, surrounded by gold and silk, yet he was gasping for air like a man trapped in a box, clawing at his own throat as the invisible bricks of Al-Hakam's judgment began to stack themselves, one by one, around his terrified soul. By the time the muezzin called the faithful to the dawn prayer on the fourth day, sending his voice spiraling up into the copper-colored sky from the minaret, Qadi Harun had not slept for 80 hours, and the world had begun to assume the treacherous, shifting quality of a mirage. He rose from his bed not with the vigor of a magistrate, but with the disjointed, jerky movements of a marionette whose strings are being pulled by a drunken master. The morning light that filtered through the mashrabiyah screens did not bring the clarity of day. Instead, it cast a grid of shadows across the floor that looked, to Harun's fevered eyes, indistinguishable from the iron grate of a dungeon cell. He attempted to dress himself, shooing away the servants with a guttural snarl, but as he pulled his silken under-tunic over his head, he panicked. The fabric, usually light as a spider's web, felt suddenly heavy, abrasive, and suffocating, as if he were pulling a sack of rough hemp over his face. He tore at it, ripping the expensive weave, gasping for air that seemed too thin to sustain him, his heart battering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a chimney. He stood naked in the center of his opulent chamber, shivering despite the oppressive heat of the Damascus morning, his skin prickling with a sensation that was not quite pain, but a dull, insistent pressure, as if the very atmosphere of the room had increased its density, pressing against his pores with the weight of deep water. He forced himself to don his official robes, the crimson silk now feeling like a shroud, and descended to the court, determined to outrun the madness that was nipping at his heels by immersing himself in the cruelty of his work. But as he sat upon his high bench, gripping the ironwood gavel until his knuckles turned white, he found that the architecture of the courtroom had turned against him. The vast hall, supported by pillars of marble that had stood since the days of the early caliphs, seemed to have lost its rigidity. When he looked at the distant walls, they appeared to undulate, breathing in and out like the flanks of a great beast. Worse still, they seemed closer than they had been the day before. The gallery of onlookers, usually a sea of distinct faces, blurred into a singular, grey mass that resembled the rough texture of mortar. When a petitioner, a weeping widow seeking redress for a stolen goat, stepped forward to speak, her voice sounded tinny and distant, as if she were shouting down a long, narrow pipe. Harun squinted, leaning forward, and for a terrifying instant, the widow's face vanished, replaced by the visage of the mystic he had entombed, not the man's living face, but his face as it must look now, in the dark, with the oxygen running low. Harun slammed his gavel down, not to render a verdict, but to shatter the hallucination. The crack of the wood echoed like a gunshot, but instead of commanding silence, it triggered a ringing in his ears, a high-pitched whine that mimicked the silence of the grave. He dismissed the court in a frenzy, shouting that the air was foul, that the people were too close, that they were crowding him, suffocating him, though the nearest guard stood 10 paces away. He fled the bench, his robes trailing behind him like a river of blood, leaving the assembly to murmur in confused fear that the Qadi was possessed by a jinni of the waste. By the 5th night, the sensation of confinement had migrated from his chest and his mind into the very fibers of his limbs, binding his arms to his sides with invisible chains that no smith had ever forged. He lay upon his divan, the oil lamps burning low, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for his throat. He tried to reach for a goblet of water, for his tongue had swollen in his mouth, transforming into a dry, useless slug that tasted of copper and dust. But his arm would not obey. It was not paralyzed in the medical sense, he could feel the muscles bunching, the nerves firing, the will to move burning bright in his mind. But his arm met a resistance that was not there. It was as if the air 2 inches from his skin had solidified into diamond-hard stone. He pushed, he strained, the veins in his neck bulging, sweat pouring from his brow in a torrent, but he could not lift his hand more than a few inches from his flank. He was fighting a phantom enclosure, a sarcophagus composed of nothing but the curse and his own terror. He looked down at his body, expecting to see ropes, chains, or bands of iron, but there was nothing, only his own trembling flesh, turning the color of grey parchment, drained of blood and vitality. The illusion was total, his tactile sense was reporting that he was wedged tight in a vertical shaft, his elbows pinned, his knees unable to spread, while his eyes reported that he was lying in a room 40 feet wide. The dissonance between what he saw and what he felt began to fracture his mind like a hammer striking glass. He began to weep, but even the tears felt heavy, sliding down his cheeks like droplets of lead. The oppression was absolute. He could feel the texture of the walls pressing against his shoulders, a rough, cold grittiness that abraded his skin through the silk of his nightshirt. He could smell the mortar now, not as a faint whiff, but as the only scent in the world, a dry, alkaline stench that coated the back of his throat and choked the breath from him. He realized, with a jolt of horror that transcended sanity, that he was no longer merely haunted by the mystic, he was becoming him. He was experiencing the exact physical reality of the man in the well, synchronized across space by a divine conduit of judgment. The mystic was currently dying of thirst and compression in the dark, and so Harun, surrounded by water he could not reach and space he could not use, must also die of thirst and compression. He tried to roll off the divan, to hurl himself to the floor to break the sensation, but he could only rock slightly from side to side, like a man bound in a straitjacket. The panic rose in a black tide, consuming his reason. He opened his mouth to scream, to beg the guards to cut the invisible bonds, to break down the walls that only he could feel, but his jaw would only open a fraction of an inch before hitting the resistance. The scream died in his throat, emerging as a pathetic, gargling whimper, the sound of a man buried alive trying to shout through 6 feet of earth. Outside the heavy oak doors of the chamber, the servants and the guards had gathered, drawn by the sounds of the struggle. They huddled in the corridor, the flickering torchlight casting their frightened faces into sharp relief. They heard the thumping, the wheezing, the soft, desperate cries of a man fighting a battle against the air itself. One brave soul, the chamberlain, knelt and pressed his eye to the large, brass keyhole, peering into the forbidden sanctum. What he saw froze the blood in his veins and sent a tremor of supernatural dread through his frame. He saw his master, the great and terrible Qadi Harun, lying alone on the divan in the center of the vast, empty room. There was no attacker, no intruder, no spirit visible to the mortal eye. Yet, Harun was thrashing with a violence that shook the furniture. His body was contorted, his muscles pulled taut as bowstrings, his face purple with exertion. He looked for all the world like a man being crushed between 2 giant millstones, or a man trying to expand his lungs inside a suit of iron armor that was slowly shrinking. He saw Harun's hands clawing at his own thighs, unable to lift away, his head snapping back and forth as if dodging blows, his eyes rolling up into his skull until only the whites were visible, blind, terrified orbs staring into a darkness that the chamberlain could not see. The servant recoiled from the door, his face ashen, crossing himself and whispering the names of God, for he knew then that they were witnessing an execution carried out by the executioner himself, a private apocalypse occurring within the confines of a single mind. Inside the room, Harun's reality had narrowed to the width of a coffin. The vast ceiling with its gold leaf and lapis lazuli was gone, replaced by the crushing dark. The expensive rugs were gone, replaced by cold, damp stone. He was alone in the dark, and the walls were closing in, inch by merciless inch, squeezing the life, the pride, and the soul out of him, returning him to the dust from which he had risen with such arrogance. On the 7th day, the sun rose over Damascus not as a bringer of light, but as a tyrant ascending his throne, casting a pall of white-hot misery over the city that turned the dust of the streets into a choking powder and the waters of the Barada River into a sluggish, tepid soup. It was a holy day, a Friday, when the faithful would gather in the cool, shadowed colonnades of the Umayyad Mosque to bow their foreheads to the rugs and whisper the names of the Almighty, but in the residence of Qadi Harun, there was no holiness, only a thick, suffocating dread that hung in the corridors like the smoke of an extinguished candle. The 7th day marked the completion of the cycle, the number of perfection in the ancient scripts, and it was upon this day that the madness of the magistrate reached its terrifying, abyssal zenith. He had not eaten since the sentencing, he had not drunk water for 2 days, for every time he brought a cup to his lips, he felt the rim of a stone bucket knocking against his teeth, and tasted only the foul, brackish mud of a dried-up spring. The physical deterioration of the man was shocking to behold, a rapid withering that seemed to accelerate with every hour, as if the life force was being sucked out of him by a vacuum, drawn through the floorboards and into the earth to feed the thing he had buried. But it was the architecture of his mind that had truly collapsed, burying him beneath the rubble of his own broken sanity. Harun had ceased to move about the room. The vast, luxurious bedchamber, with its intricate mosaics and high, vaulted ceilings designed to catch the breeze, had ceased to exist for him. In his perception, the walls had finished their inward march. They were no longer approaching, they had arrived. He stood, or rather, crouched, in the exact center of the Persian rug, occupying a square of space no larger than the footprint of a man. To the observer, to the terrified servants who took turns peering through the intricate latticework of the keyhole, he was a figure of pitiable madness, standing alone in a room full of empty air, his arms pinned to his sides, his head bowed, his knees bent as if carrying a colossal weight. But to Harun, the reality was viscerally, agonizingly different. He was not in a palace. He was deep underground. The darkness was absolute, a blackness so thick it felt like a liquid filling his eye sockets, pressing against the optic nerve until sparks of phantom light exploded in his brain like dying stars. He could feel the cold, rough texture of the limestone blocks pressing against his shoulders, his hips, the outsides of his thighs. The stone was damp, slick with the condensation of the earth, and it smelled of centuries of rot, of dead beetles and stagnant air that had not moved since the days of the Romans. He tried to inhale, but the air was gone. There was only the recycled warmth of his own breath, bouncing off the stone inches from his face and returning to him, hot and sour. He gasped, his chest heaving, but his ribs struck the walls before his lungs could fully inflate. It was a torture of geometry. The space he occupied was precisely the volume of his own body, minus the necessary inch required to live. He felt the panic rising not as an emotion, but as a physical creature, a parasite writhing in his gut, demanding an exit that did not exist. He opened his mouth to scream, a primal, animalistic urge to expel the terror, to shatter the stone with the force of his voice, but the scream never left his throat. In his mind, the earth was packed tight against his face. If he opened his mouth, the dirt would pour in, choking him, filling his gullet with grit and silence. So he screamed without sound, his jaw hyper-extended, his neck muscles straining like steel cables, the veins in his temples bulging to the point of rupture. It was a silent mime of the damned, a horrific tableau of a man drowning in a sea of air. The sensation of the pointing finger returned to him then, not as a memory, but as a physical brand. He remembered the mystic in the court, the way the man had traced the name of Al-Hakam in the stale air. The judge. The arbitrator. Harun realized, with a clarity that seared his mind like a branding iron, that he was not merely being punished, he was being corrected. He had sought to be the ultimate authority, to define the boundaries of other men's lives, to box them in with his verdicts. Now, the attribute of Al-Hakam was manifesting in its purest, most terrifying form, absolute constriction. The divine will was showing him the true nature of the limits he had imposed on others. He was being compressed by the very authority he had claimed to wield. The irony was a physical weight, pressing down on the crown of his head, forcing his spine to compress, his vertebrae grinding together with a sound like crushing gravel. He began to sink lower, his legs trembling violently under the strain of holding up the imaginary ceiling that was descending upon him. He dropped to his knees, but the relief was momentary. The walls followed him down. The shaft was narrowing. He could feel the rough mortar scraping the skin from his arms, raw and bleeding, though his silk robe remained untouched to the naked eye. He felt the grit under his fingernails as he clawed at the empty air, believing he was digging into the stone, tearing at the masonry in a futile attempt to find a weakness in the construction. He shredded the skin of his own face, leaving long, bloody furrows across his cheeks, thinking he was clawing through the mud that threatened to engulf him. The pain was distant, irrelevant. What mattered was the space. He needed space. Just 1 inch. Just a pocket's width of air. He curled inward, assuming the fetal position, the ancient, instinctive posture of the unborn and the dying. He drew his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins, tucking his chin down to his sternum. He was trying to make himself small, to fold himself into a shape that could exist within the shrinking singularity of his prison. Outside, in the corridor, the silence from the room was more terrifying than the screams had been. The household staff had gathered, a huddled mass of trembling humanity, clutching amulets and whispering prayers. The heat in the hallway was sweltering, yet they shivered as if a winter wind blew from the cracks of the door. They heard the soft, wet sounds of Harun's struggle, the scuffing of his heels on the carpet, the wet slap of his hands against his own flesh, the high, whistling wheeze of his restricted breathing. It sounded like a large animal trapped in a sack, thrashing blindly against the fabric. The captain of the guard, a man who had faced charging cavalry without flinching, stood with his hand on the hilt of his sword, sweat stinging his eyes, unable to bring himself to turn the handle. He knew, with the instinct of a warrior, that the enemy in that room was not one that could be fought with steel. It was an execution carried out by the air itself, a sentence passed by the unseen. Inside, the implosion continued. Harun was no longer Qadi Harun. He was no longer a man of status. He was a biological machine reacting to the stimulus of total confinement. His mind fractured into 1,000 shards of panic. He hallucinated that the water from the well was rising, cold and black, swirling around his ankles, then his waist. He could feel the chill of it, the slimy caress of water weeds against his skin. He held his breath, his cheeks puffing out, his eyes bulging, convinced that the water was closing over his head. He thrashed on the floor, swimming in the Persian rug, kicking against the crushing tide. Then the water vanished, replaced by sand, hot, dry, suffocating sand pouring down from above, burying him, filling his ears, his nose, weighting his eyelids. He clawed at his face to clear the sand, tearing his eyelids, his lips. He was fighting the elements of the earth, and the earth was winning. The pressure increased. It was no longer just the walls, it was the universe itself contracting. The vastness of the cosmos was shrinking to a point, and he was at the center, the focal point of a cosmic crushing. He felt his ribs bending inward, the cage of his chest giving way under the strain of the invisible vice. He could hear the creaking of his own bones, a dry, snapping sound that echoed in the silence of his skull. He tried to beg, to offer everything he owned, his gold, his mansion, his position, in exchange for a breath, but his mind could not form the words, and his tongue was a stone in his mouth. He was bargaining with gravity, negotiating with physics. The name Al-Hakam pulsed in his brain, a drumbeat of judgment. You sought to bind, and now you are bound. You sought to silence, and now you are silenced. You sought to crush, and now you are crushed. He rolled onto his side, curled so tightly that his spine threatened to snap. He was trying to occupy zero space. He was trying to become a singularity. The terror was beyond fear now, it was a state of being. He was pure sensation, the sensation of being squeezed out of existence. He felt the presence of the mystic, not as a ghost, but as a mirror. He was the mystic. The mystic was him. There was no separation. The bricks he had ordered laid were laid against his own skin. The mortar he had paid for was drying in his own mouth. The darkness he had commanded was the darkness that now ate his vision. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness inside was the same as the darkness outside. There was no escape, for the prison was not a place, it was a condition of his soul, and he carried it with him, an inescapable, crushing aura that folded him in on himself, tighter, and tighter, and tighter. The air in the room remained still, undisturbed by any wind, heavy with the scent of fear and the metallic tang of blood, while on the floor, the most powerful magistrate in Damascus lay weeping without tears, crushed by the weight of a justice he had thought he controlled, but which had, in the end, claimed him as its primary vessel. The sun beat down on the roof, indifferent and cruel, baking the house like a clay oven, while inside, the final brick of the mind was slid into place, sealing the Qadi in a tomb of his own making, awaiting the final, inevitable collapse of the structure of his life. When the sun finally breached the horizon on the morning of the 8th day, painting the minarets of Damascus in hues of violent orange and bruised purple, the silence emerging from the bedchamber of Qadi Harun had transformed from a mere absence of sound into a heavy, resonant dread that settled upon the household like a shroud of lead. The screaming had ceased hours ago, replaced by a stillness so profound that the very air in the corridor seemed to vibrate with the tension of a held breath. The captain of the guard, a man whose skin was leathery from years of desert campaigns and whose heart had been hardened by the witnessing of 1,000 atrocities, found his hand trembling as it rested upon the pommel of his scimitar. He stood before the great double doors of oak and iron, flanked by servants whose faces were the color of ash, their eyes wide with the superstitious terror that thrives in the dark corners of the human mind. They had knocked, timidly at first, then with increasing desperation, but no answer had come from within, no curse, no command, not even the ragged weeping that had marked the previous nights. There was only the silence, a mute and terrifying testament to a conclusion that none dared to voice. Driven by a duty that felt increasingly like a march toward the gallows, the captain signaled to his strongest men. They stepped forward, their shoulders broadly set, carrying a heavy battering ram improvised from a cedar log usually reserved for barring the outer gates. With a collective grunt that echoed obscenely in the quiet house, they swung the timber. The wood of the door splintered with a sound like a cracking bone, the iron bolts shrieking in protest as they were torn from the masonry. It took 3 blows, each louder and more desperate than the last, before the lock gave way, and the doors swung inward with a mournful groan, revealing the sanctum of the magistrate. The air that rushed out to meet them was not the stale, hot air of a closed room, it was cold, unnaturally so, carrying a scent that made the guards gag and cover their noses with the tails of their turbans. It was the smell of deep, wet earth, of ancient limestone turning to dust, and the metallic, coppery tang of blood that has been squeezed from the vein. The captain stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching on splinters of wood, his sword drawn though he knew with a chilling certainty that steel would be of no use here. The room was bathed in the half-light of the morning sun filtering through the heavy drapes, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. At first glance, the chamber appeared deserted, the vast expanse of the Persian rugs undisturbed, the furniture standing in silent judgment. But as the captain's eyes adjusted to the gloom, his gaze was drawn inexorably to the center of the room, to the place where the intricate patterns of the carpet converged. There, lying in a heap that defied the laws of anatomy and nature, was the thing that had been Qadi Harun. The men behind the captain gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a wind rushing through a graveyard, and some fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the floor in frantic prayer. Harun was dead, but he had not died as men die. He lay on his side, but his body was compressed into a horrific, unnatural shape, as if he had been forced into a container that was far too small for his frame. His knees were driven into his chest with such force that the thigh bones had snapped, the jagged ends tearing through the crimson silk of his nightclothes. His head was tucked down between his shoulders, his chin ground into his sternum, his neck broken at a sharp, impossible angle. His arms were wrapped around his shins, fused there by a rigor mortis that had set in with instantaneous and brutal violence. But it was the overall geometry of the corpse that froze the blood in the captain's veins. The body was not merely curled, it was compacted. The ribcage was crushed inward, flattened not from above, but from all sides, as if the magistrate had been gripped in the fist of a giant titan and squeezed until the breath and life were wrung from him. The width of his shoulders, the breadth of his hips, all had been reduced, crushed inward to fit a cylindrical dimension that existed only in the terrifying reality of his final moments. The captain approached the body, his steps slow and heavy, fighting the urge to flee from this place of blasphemy. He knelt beside the corpse and saw the face of the magistrate. It was a mask of absolute, frozen horror, the eyes bulging from their sockets like boiled eggs, staring blindly into a darkness that the living could not see. The skin was blue and mottled, bearing the distinct, gritty impression of rough stone, though there was no stone to be seen. Across the cheeks and forehead, the flesh was abraded and raw, scraped away as if Haroun had rubbed his face against a coarse surface for hours in a desperate attempt to find air. The mouth was agape, locked in a silent scream, filled with a mixture of blood and a grey, powdery dust that looked suspiciously like dried mortar. The captain reached out a gloved hand and touched the magistrate's shoulder. The flesh was hard as rock, cold as the grave. There was no softness left, no give to the muscle. It was as if the body had been transfigured into the very stone he had feared. The captain recoiled, wiping his glove on his tunic, his mind reeling with the impossible implication. The man had been crushed to death in the center of an empty room, surrounded by 20 feet of open air, yet his body bore the marks of being entombed in a space no wider than a beggar's well. The well, the captain whispered, the realization striking him with the force of a physical blow. The word rippled through the gathered servants, a murmur of terrified understanding. The well. The well. They scrambled backward, fleeing the room as if the corpse were contagious, stumbling over one another in their haste to reach the courtyard. The captain followed, his face grim, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They burst into the blinding glare of the morning sun, the heat hitting them like a physical wall, contrasting sharply with the sepulchral chill of the bedroom. In the center of the courtyard, the drying well stood innocuous and silent, the fresh masonry of the seal gleaming white and innocent in the light. It looked like any other construction, a simple circle of stones, yet to the men who stood trembling before it, it loomed like a gateway to Jahannam. The captain barked an order, his voice cracking with strain, commanding the masons to be brought forward. They arrived with their tools, their faces pale, knowing that they had been participants in a crime that had now garnered divine attention. "Open it," the captain commanded, pointing his shaking finger at the seal. "Tear it down." The masons hesitated, looking from the captain to the stone, fear of the magistrate's ghost warring with fear of the captain's sword. The sword won. With trembling hands, they raised their sledgehammers and pickaxes. The first blow rang out like a tolling bell, chipping the white stone. Then another, and another. The courtyard was filled with the frantic clinking of metal on masonry, a feverish attempt to undo what had been done. The guards stood back, hands on their weapons, half expecting a demon to burst forth from the stone. As the mortar gave way and the bricks were pried loose, a strange phenomenon occurred. There was no smell of decay. 7 days had passed since the mystic had been sealed in the suffocating dark, 7 days of heat and thirst. By all the laws of nature, the stench of death should have been overpowering, a miasma to sicken the strongest stomach. Yet, the air that drifted up from the widening hole was cool, sweet, and carried the faint, inexplicable scent of jasmine and rain. When the final course of bricks was removed and the mouth of the well gaped open like a dark eye staring at the sun, the silence returned, absolute and heavy. The captain moved forward, taking a lantern from a servant. He struck the flint, lit the wick, and tied the handle to a rope. Slowly, hand over hand, he lowered the light into the abyss. The men crowded around, peering over the edge, their shadows stretching long and thin across the courtyard stones. Down the light went, illuminating the rough, moss-slicked walls of the shaft. They expected to see the huddled, rotting form of the dervish, broken and dead at the bottom. The light reached the floor of the well, revealing the damp earth and the scattered debris of the construction. The well was empty. There was no body. No rags of burlap. No bones. The space was swept clean, as if it had never been occupied by a mortal man. The mystic had vanished, dissolved into the ether, or perhaps he had never been there at all, but was merely a manifestation of the conscience that Haroun had long ago murdered. The men stared, their minds unable to grasp the void where a victim should be. But as the lantern swung gently, casting its yellow glow across the stones of the well's floor, the light caught the jagged edges of something scratched into the damp wall, low down, where a man might sit. The captain squinted, leaning dangerously far over the lip of the well to read the script. It was not written in blood, nor in charcoal, but etched deep into the hard limestone with a force that no human finger should possess. The script was archaic, angular, and radiated a power that made the captain's eyes water. He read the words aloud, his voice trembling in the hush of the courtyard, delivering the final verdict to the terrified assembly. "The judgment of the earth is for the bodies of men," he read, the words hanging in the hot air like smoke. "But the judgment of the confinement belongs to the soul. I have gone to the open plains of the mercy, and left the narrow place for he who built it." The lantern flickered and died, plunging the bottom of the well back into darkness, but the truth remained illuminated in the minds of every soul present. They looked back toward the upper window of the mansion, where the twisted, crushed husk of Qadi Harun lay on his expensive rug, a man who had constructed a prison of stone for another, only to find that the architecture of divine justice is not bound by walls, and that he had, brick by brick, day by day, walled himself into a tomb that no mason could ever unseal. The captain let the rope fall from his hand, the darkness of the well swallowing it whole, and walked away from the house of the magistrate, leaving the doors open to the street, for there was nothing left inside that belonged to the world of men.